The forward operating base sat beneath a sky bruised purple and gold, dust hanging in the air like static. In the operations tent, 24 operators from SEAL Team 6 listened to their mission briefing with the calm of men who'd walked through fire before. The target compound sat 12 clicks north, tucked between irrigation ditches and compounds that all looked identical from altitude. High-value target, time-sensitive intelligence, standard direct action. What wasn't standard was the close air support call sign penciled onto the mission roster, Hawkeye 2-1. The name meant nothing to most of them. To a few, it meant everything they didn't want on their six when bullets started flying. The lead officer, a barrel-chested senior chief with 20 years of kills under his belt, read the call sign twice before his jaw tightened. He said nothing, but the silence said plenty. In the back of the tent, a younger operator leaned toward his teammate and whispered something that ended with the word washout. The tent stayed quiet, but the judgment had been passed. 30 miles south, Captain Mariana Hawkeye Kovac sat in her A-10 Thunderbolt beneath a camouflage net, running pre-flight checks with methodical precision. Her hands moved across switches and dials without hesitation, muscle memory carved from 3,000 hours in the cockpit. The warthog around her was scarred and ugly, painted in desert gray with faded unit markings along the fuselage. 1,100 rounds of 30mm ammunition sat in the nose-mounted GAU-8 rotary cannon, each round the size of a milk bottle. Maverick missiles hung beneath the wings like sleeping predators. She wore a flight suit darkened by sweat and a helmet scuffed from ejection training she'd never needed to use in combat. Her face was angular and sun-darkened, eyes the color of Baltic winter. No makeup, no softness, just the hard-earned look of someone who'd learned to survive by being better than necessary. The radio crackled, operations calling for pre-flight confirmation. She responded with clipped professionalism, her accent barely noticeable unless you listened for the way she pronounced certain vowels. Croatian by birth, American by choice, military by calling. The controller on the other end acknowledged and went silent. No banter, no encouragement. She'd stopped expecting either. 6 months ago, she'd been pulled from an elite fighter squadron after refusing to falsify maintenance reports that would have kept jets flying past safety margins. The complaint went up her chain of command and came back down as a reassignment. They called it lateral movement. Everyone else called it punishment. Now she flew the Warthog, the plane nobody wanted, supporting missions where precision mattered less than loiter time. The brass smiled when they handed her the orders. They thought she'd quit. She didn't. The SEALs inserted at 0:30 under a moonless sky, 4 MH-60 Black Hawks dropping them into fields still wet with irrigation runoff. They moved in two-man teams, night vision painting the world in shades of green and gray, weapons tucked tight as they crossed open ground toward the compound. The target building was 2 stories, thick-walled adobe with a courtyard and a single gate facing east. Intelligence said 6 hostiles inside, small arms, possibly explosives. The SEALs had handled worse before breakfast. The senior chief led the breach team while the others established overwatch positions on rooftops and behind low walls. Radio checks came back clean. Hawkeye 2-1 orbited 8,000 feet overhead, invisible in the darkness. On their screens, she was just a radar blip holding station. They didn't call her down. The breach went smooth until it didn't. The gate blew inward under a shotgun blast and the first team entered fast, scanning corners and doorways with practiced efficiency. Then the walls lit up. Not 6 hostiles, but 20, firing from windows and reinforced positions they'd prepared days before. The intelligence had been wrong or the target had been warned. Didn't matter which. What mattered was the volume of fire now pouring into the courtyard, pinning the assault team behind a stone fountain while their overwatch tried to suppress shooters from 3 different buildings. The senior chief's voice came over the radio, tight and controlled. Troops in contact, taking effective fire, requesting immediate close air support. The controller acknowledged and relayed coordinates. Then came the call sign assignment. Hawkeye 2-1, you're cleared hot. The senior chief heard it through his earpiece and swore once, low and vicious. But he was too busy keeping his men alive to argue. Mariana heard the call and rolled the Warthog into a diving left turn that pulled 4GS against her body. The night vision display showed the compound as a cluster of heat signatures and geometric shapes. She descended to 4,000 feet, lower than recommended, and activated the targeting pod. The infrared camera painted the battlefield in perfect clarity. Friendly forces marked by IR strobes clustered behind cover, while muzzle flashes erupted from surrounding buildings. She counted firing positions and calculated angles of attack that wouldn't put 30mm rounds through friendlies. Her breathing stayed even. Her hands stayed steady. The radio chatter was frantic now, voices overlapping as the SEALs called out targets and casualties. One man down in the courtyard, another hit in the leg behind the fountain. They needed relief, and they needed it now. She armed the GAU-8 and spoke into her radio, voice calm as stone. Hawkeye 2-1, tally target building coming in from the west. The controller acknowledged. Nobody else said a word. The Warthog dropped like a falcon, nose angling toward the northern building where the heaviest fire originated. At 2,000 feet she squeezed the trigger and the cannon roared, a sound like the sky tearing in half. 70 rounds per second chewed through the building's upper floor, punching through walls and bodies with equal indifference. The infrared camera showed heat signatures disappearing, weapons falling silent. She pulled up hard, banking right to line up the next pass. The eastern building now, shooters on the roof. She came in lower this time, 1,500 feet, and walked cannon fire across the rooftop in a line so precise it looked like surgery. Concrete exploded, bodies tumbled, and the shooting stopped. On the ground the SEALs pushed forward, using the suppression to gain ground and extract their wounded. The senior chief said nothing into the radio, but his team was moving, and that was all the acknowledgement Mariana needed. She climbed back to 4,000 feet and circled, eyes scanning for new threats. Then the warning lights lit up her cockpit like a Christmas display. Missile launch, surface-to-air, tracking inbound. The threat receiver screamed in her headset. Someone in the compound had a MANPADS, probably a decades-old Stinger or Russian Strela, but age didn't matter when it was coming for your aircraft. She deployed flares and chaff, bright magnesium blooms falling away as she broke hard right and dove. The missile followed, motor burning white-hot on her infrared display. She jinked left, then right, pulling the Warthog through turns that made her vision narrow and her chest compress. The missile stayed locked. It was close now, seconds from impact. She shoved the stick forward into a near-vertical dive, trading altitude for speed, and pulled up so hard the airframe groaned. The missile overshot by 20 feet and detonated above her, shrapnel peppering the tail and right wing. She felt the impact through the stick, a shudder that meant something important had just broken. The hydraulic pressure gauge dropped. Flight controls went mushy. She fought the aircraft level and checked her systems. Fuel leak from the right wing tank, hydraulic system degraded to backup, tail damage unknown, still flyable, barely. The SEALs secured the compound while she held overhead, circling on fumes and backup systems. They found the high-value target dead in a back room, killed during her gun runs. Mission accomplished. The wounded were loaded onto medevac Black Hawks while the assault team policed brass and prepped for exfil. The senior chief finally keyed his radio voice different now, lacking the edge it had before. Hawkeye 2-1, targets destroyed, friendly casualties evacuated, were clear for exfil. She acknowledged and turned south, every movement of the stick a negotiation with an aircraft that wanted to roll inverted and die. The right wing was hemorrhaging fuel in a visible stream that showed up on her mirror as a dark trail against the stars. She pulled back power to conserve what remained and began calculating whether she'd make it back to base or have to punch out over empty desert. The math wasn't encouraging. Fuel at 8% and dropping. 70 miles to go. She flew on anyway because quitting wasn't in her vocabulary, and never had been. The operations tent got the call 30 minutes later. Hawkeye 2-1 inbound, battle damage, fuel critical, requesting priority landing. The tower cleared all traffic and rolled the emergency response teams. Mariana brought the Warthog in low and slow, hydraulics barely responding, fuel gauge reading 0 but the engine still turning. She touched down hard, nose gear slamming onto concrete, and rolled to a stop halfway down the runway. Fuel streamed from torn panels along the wing, pooling beneath the aircraft in a dark slick. She shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit for 10 seconds, hands still on the stick, breathing the silence. Then she popped the canopy and climbed down. Maintenance crews surrounded the Warthog, staring at the damage. 37 holes in the fuselage and wings, hydraulic lines shredded, fuel tank punctured, tail section held together by hope and aluminum. One crew chief whistled low and shook his head. He'd seen aircraft written off for less. The SEALs came to the flight line 3 hours later, still in their gear, faces streaked with dirt and cordite residue. The senior chief walked straight to where Mariana stood beside her aircraft, now surrounded by mechanics with clipboards and worried expressions. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her for a long moment, jaw working like he was chewing words he didn't want to swallow. Then he extended his hand. His grip was iron and his eyes were honest. He didn't apologize because operators didn't apologize for doubting until you proved them wrong. But he nodded once, slow and deliberate, and that was worth more than any words. His team stood behind him, faces unreadable but no longer dismissive. They'd seen what she'd done when it mattered. They'd heard the cannon runs that saved their assault. They'd watched her bring a dying aircraft home on fumes and determination. One of the younger operators, the same one who'd whispered in the briefing tent, met her eyes and gave a slight nod. No smile, no commentary, just recognition. The base commander called her into his office the next morning. She expected a reprimand for bringing back a shot-up aircraft or maybe questions about why she'd flown so low during the gun runs. Instead, he stood when she entered and gestured to a chair. He was a colonel with 3 decades of service and eyes that had seen enough combat to fill libraries. He asked her to walk him through the mission, every decision, every pass, every moment between the missile launch and the landing. She did, clinically and without embellishment. When she finished, he leaned back and studied her like she was a puzzle he'd just solved. He told her the SEALs had filed their after-action report. They'd used words like decisive, precise, and unflinching. The senior chief had personally recommended her for a medal, though they both knew how those things worked in the bureaucracy. What mattered was the recommendation itself, the acknowledgement from men who didn't give praise unless it was earned in blood. The colonel asked her one question: why didn't you eject when the missile hit? She thought about it, searching for an answer that wasn't just stubbornness or pride. Finally, she said, because they needed me overhead until exfil was complete. He nodded like that was exactly what he'd expected to hear. Word spread through the base the way word always spreads in tight military communities. By evening, the story had grown teeth and details, some accurate and some invented. They talked about the A-10 that came back streaming fuel, the pilot who'd taken a missile hit and stayed on station, the gun runs so close the SEALs could feel the shockwave. Call signs that had been whispered with skepticism were now spoken with something approaching reverence. Mariana heard none of it because she was in the maintenance hangar, helping the crew chief assess damage and prioritize repairs. The Warthog would fly again, but it would take time and parts they didn't have in theater. She ran her hand along the torn wing panel, feeling the jagged edges where shrapnel had punched through. The aircraft had saved her life by refusing to quit. She owed it the same loyalty. The crew chief watched her and finally asked the question everyone wanted to ask. How'd you keep it flying with hydraulics shot and fuel pouring out? She looked at him and almost smiled. You just do, she said, because the alternative is unacceptable. 3 weeks later, they gave her a new mission. Another high-risk direct action, another SEAL team, another compound in another part of the province. This time, when the briefing officer read her call sign, nobody whispered. The senior chief was there again, leading a different team on a different objective, and when he saw her name on the roster, he caught her eye across the tent and nodded. That was all. No speeches, no introductions. Just the understanding between people who'd been in the fire together and come out the other side. She flew the mission in a different A-10, her regular bird still in pieces awaiting parts from Germany. This aircraft was newer, less scarred, but she missed the familiar cockpit of the one she'd brought home bleeding fuel. The mission went clean. No missile launches, no emergencies, just textbook close air support that kept the ground team covered while they accomplished their objective. Afterward, the SEALs called her down to their compound and handed her a team patch, the trident and eagle embroidered in black and gold. They didn't give those to outsiders. She understood what it meant and accepted it without ceremony. Her original A-10 returned to service 6 weeks after the mission. The crew chief had personally overseen every repair, refusing to sign off until the aircraft met standards higher than regulation required. When Mariana walked into the hangar and saw it sitting under the lights, fully restored and repainted, something in her chest tightened. The crew chief handed her the logbook and pointed to a small detail beneath the cockpit. There, stenciled in white paint alongside the mission marks, was a single notation, 01 Alpha, the first mission where she'd taken battle damage and brought it home. He'd marked it the way fighter pilots marked kills, because bringing an aircraft back alive was just as important as any target destroyed. She signed the logbook and ran her pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision as always. But when she climbed into the cockpit and settled into the seat, it felt like coming home. The switches were worn smooth where her hands had touched them 1,000 times. The stick fit her grip perfectly. This aircraft knew her and she knew it, and together they were something more than the sum of their parts. The months that followed brought more missions, more close calls, more moments where precision and timing meant the difference between success and disaster. Mariana flew them all with the same unflinching competence that had earned her the respect she'd never asked for. Other pilots started requesting her by call sign when they needed CAS over hostile territory. Ground commanders who'd heard the stories wanted Hawkeye overhead when things got complicated. Her reputation spread beyond the SEALs to Marine recon teams and Army Rangers and Special Forces ODAs operating in remote valleys. They called her the Guardian, the Angel, the pilot who stayed when everyone else went home. She never encouraged the mythology, but she didn't discourage it either. What mattered was the work, the missions, the men and women on the ground who needed someone watching their backs. She was that someone, and she wore the responsibility like armor. The brass noticed. The same officers who'd smiled when they reassigned her now wrote fitness reports filled with words like exemplary and irreplaceable. They didn't apologize either. That wasn't how the military worked. On a clear morning 8 months after the first mission with the SEALs, Mariana sat in the operations tent reviewing reconnaissance photos for an upcoming strike. The target was a weapons cache in a mountain valley, heavily defended, requiring multiple passes and perfect timing. The mission commander was a Marine colonel she'd worked with twice before, a steady professional who trusted his people to do their jobs. He laid out the plan, assigned responsibilities, and turned to her for final coordination. She asked 3 questions about terrain and approach vectors, got answers that satisfied her tactical sense, and confirmed her part of the mission. The briefing ended and personnel filed out, heading to their aircraft and positions. The colonel stopped her at the tent entrance and asked if she'd ever considered transitioning to fighters again. The offer was implicit, the kind of thing that got mentioned casually but carried weight. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she told him she was exactly where she needed to be. He studied her face, found what he was looking for, and nodded. "Good," he said, "because we need you here." The mission launched at dawn, 4 A-10s in formation with her in the lead. They flew north through mountain passes that rose like cathedral walls, peaks still dusted with snow despite the desert heat below. The target valley appeared ahead, narrow and steep-sided, with the weapons cache tucked against the northern cliff face. She led the flight in from the east, descending in a tactical spiral that kept them unpredictable and gave each pilot a clear view of the target area. Air defenses opened up halfway through the first pass, tracers arcing up from concealed positions like deadly fireworks. She called them out over the radio, calm and precise, marking each position for suppression. The flight split into pairs, one element hitting the cache while the other suppressed the guns. Explosions walked across the valley floor, secondaries cooking off as munition stores detonated. She made 3 passes, each one lower than the last, placing rockets and cannon fire with surgical accuracy. When the mission ended and the flight turned south, the valley was burning and the cache was nothing but craters and twisted metal. They landed back at base to find a delegation waiting. Senior officers, unit commanders, people who rarely appeared on the flight line unless something significant had happened. Mariana climbed down from her cockpit, flight suit soaked with sweat, and wondered what regulation she'd violated. Instead, the base commander stepped forward with a smile that looked almost genuine. He told her the Secretary of the Air Force had approved her medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross for the mission where she'd taken the missile hit and stayed on station. The ceremony would be in 2 weeks, formal uniforms, full protocol. She nodded and said thank you because that was what you did, but inside she felt nothing but quiet satisfaction that someone had finally acknowledged what she'd known all along. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. The doubters and the brass and the operators, who'd whispered in briefing tents, had simply needed to see it for themselves. The ceremony took place in front of the entire wing, hundreds of personnel standing in formation under a sun that hammered the flight line like a forge. The commanding general read the citation, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks. It detailed the mission, the missile hit, the battle damage, the landing that should have been impossible. It used phrases like extraordinary heroism and selfless dedication, words that felt too large for what she'd simply considered doing her job. When he pinned the medal to her uniform, cameras flashed and people applauded. The SEALs were there, standing in a group off to the side, still in their combat fatigues because they'd just returned from another mission. The senior chief caught her eye and gave that same slow nod he'd given on the flight line months before. No smile, no ceremony, just acknowledgement between professionals who understood what it meant to be truly good at something dangerous. Afterward, dozens of people wanted to shake her hand, offer congratulations, tell her she deserved it. She accepted it all with grace, but what she really wanted was to get out of the dress uniform and back into her flight suit where she belonged. That evening she sat alone in her quarters, the medal resting on her desk in its presentation case. The blue ribbon and bronze star looked foreign against the Spartan functionality of the room. She'd spent her career chasing competence, not recognition, but she understood that sometimes the two intersected whether you wanted them to or not. The medal wasn't about her. It was about the standard, the expectation that when you strapped into a cockpit and took responsibility for people's lives, you delivered. Every time, without exception. She'd simply met that standard when it mattered most. The fact that so many people had doubted she could wasn't her problem. It was theirs. She closed the case and put it in her locker, then pulled out her flight suit for the next day's mission. There was always another mission, another objective, another group of operators who needed someone watching the sky above them. That was the real work. The medal was just paperwork. 3 months after the ceremony, Mariana's deployment ended. They offered her an extension, even suggested she put in for a permanent station at the forward operating base. The wing commander himself made the pitch, explaining how valuable she'd become to operations in theater, how many ground units requested her specifically, how her presence had elevated the entire close air support mission. She listened politely and declined just as politely. She had orders stateside, a training billet that would let her pass on what she'd learned to the next generation of A-10 pilots. That mattered too, maybe more than staying in one place and becoming a legend. Legends were static. Teachers created legacy. On her last day, she did a final flight over the base, a traditional flyby at pattern altitude. The crew chiefs and maintainers and operations staff stood on the flight line watching her pass, the Warthog's distinctive profile silhouetted against clouds that looked like beaten silver. She waggled the wings once in salute and turned southwest toward the tanker that would start her journey home. The senior chief found her at the passenger terminal, waiting for the C-17 that would carry her back to Germany and eventually the States. He appeared without warning, still in his combat fatigues, and sat down on the bench beside her. They didn't speak for a long moment, just sat in the companionable silence of people who'd earned each other's respect through shared danger. Finally, he asked where she was headed next. She told him about the training assignment, the chance to shape new pilots. He nodded slowly, processing that. Then he said something she'd remember for years. He said the military was full of people who were good at their jobs, competent professionals who did what was required and nothing more. But there were only a few who were truly exceptional, who elevated everyone around them through sheer force of skill and will. She was one of those few. The world needed more like her, not fewer. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just thanked him. He stood, extended his hand one last time, and walked away. She watched him go, this hard man who'd learned to trust her when trust didn't come easily, and felt the weight of what he'd said settle into her bones. The C-17 lifted off 2 hours later, banking over the base one final time before heading west. Mariana looked down at the flight line where her A-10 sat under its camouflage net, already assigned to another pilot who'd fly the same missions, face the same challenges, carry the same weight. The aircraft would endure because it was built to endure. The mission would continue because the mission always continued. But something had changed during her deployment, something that went beyond medals and recognition. She'd proven something fundamental about competence and gender, and the intersection of the two. She'd shown that skill was skill regardless of who possessed it, that prejudice was just ignorance waiting to be educated, and that respect had to be earned, but once earned became unshakable. The SEALs who'd whispered in the briefing tent would tell other SEALs the story, and those operators would remember when they saw her call sign again. The brass who tried to wash her out would write fitness reports for other female pilots and think twice about their assumptions. The legacy wasn't in the medal or the missions. It was in the changed minds and the opened doors. Stateside, she reported to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, home of the weapons school where the best combat pilots came to become even better. Her job was to teach close air support tactics to incoming A-10 pilots, to pass on the lessons she'd learned over hostile terrain with lives hanging in the balance. The students were young and eager, some arrogant, some terrified, all desperate to prove they belonged in the cockpit. She recognized herself in them, remembered being that hungry and that determined. But she also saw their weaknesses, the places where confidence outstripped capability, where bravado masked uncertainty. Her teaching style was direct and unforgiving, because combat was direct and unforgiving. She didn't coddle or cushion. She pushed until they broke or bent or became stronger. Most chose stronger. In the simulator, she'd fly as the enemy, exploiting their mistakes, forcing them to solve problems under pressure, teaching them that hesitation killed people and precision saved them. At night, she'd debrief their performance with brutal honesty, showing them exactly where they'd failed and exactly how to fix it. Some resented her, most respected her. All of them learned. One student asked her during a briefing why she'd stayed in the A-10 community when she could have gone back to fighters. The question carried assumptions, the unspoken suggestion that close air support was somehow lesser than air superiority. She looked at this young lieutenant with his fresh wings and untested theories and asked him a question in return. Did he know what it felt like to have men on the ground calling his name, because he was the only thing standing between them and death? Had he ever brought an aircraft home with battle damage because quitting meant abandoning people who trusted him? Did he understand that the Warthog wasn't a consolation prize but a calling, a mission that required different skills but equal dedication? The lieutenant had no answer. She told him he'd understand eventually or he'd wash out. There was no middle ground. Teaching wasn't just about tactics and procedures. It was about instilling the mindset that made someone effective when everything went wrong. You couldn't teach that in a classroom. You could only demonstrate it through example and hope it took root. 2 years into her teaching assignment, the Air Force asked her to speak at the academy, addressing cadets about her experiences as a female pilot in combat aviation. She initially declined, uncomfortable with being held up as an example of anything except competence. But her commander convinced her that visibility mattered, that young women considering military aviation needed to see someone who'd done it successfully. So she went, stood in front of 400 cadets in their dress uniforms, and told her story. Not the sanitized version for press releases, but the real one. The reassignment that was meant to wash her out. The whispers and doubts and assumptions. The missions that changed minds. The missile hit and the landing and the moment she climbed down from a dying aircraft and realized she'd crossed some invisible threshold from tolerated to respected. She told them the truth nobody wanted to say out loud, which was that being exceptional required being better than good enough, that some people would doubt them for reasons that had nothing to do with their capability, and that the only answer was performance that couldn't be questioned or denied. The cadets listened with an intensity that reminded her why this mattered. After the speech, a young woman approached her, probably 19 years old, with fierce eyes and questions about what it really took to succeed in combat aviation. Mariana recognized something in her, that same hunger and determination she'd carried through every challenge. She told her what nobody had told her at that age. It would be harder. People would doubt her. She'd have to be better to be considered equal. But if she could accept that, if she could use it as fuel instead of letting it become poison, she'd discover that the challenge made her sharper and stronger and ultimately more capable than she would have been without it. The young cadet nodded slowly, processing that difficult truth. Then she asked one more question. Was it worth it? Mariana thought about the SEALs who'd come to trust her, the medal in her locker, the students she was shaping into better pilots. The missions where she'd made a difference that couldn't be measured but could be felt in the lives she'd helped preserve. She looked at this young woman who might one day face her own impossible missions and told her yes. It was worth it. Every difficult moment, every doubt overcome, every time she'd proven herself against odds that shouldn't have existed. Worth it. Years later, after she'd left the instructor billet and moved into staff positions that felt increasingly distant from the cockpit, Mariana received a message through official channels. A SEAL team operating in a different theater, a different conflict, had requested an A-10 pilot by call sign for close air support on a high-risk mission. The call sign they'd requested was Hawkeye. Not her specifically, because she wasn't in theater and hadn't been for years. But they'd heard the stories, the legend that had grown from those missions and that medal, and that landing with fuel pouring from torn panels. They wanted someone like her, someone who understood that the mission was everything and personal preservation was secondary. The request moved through command channels until someone thought to notify her. She read the message in her office at the Pentagon, surrounded by paperwork and policy documents that felt meaningless compared to the clarity of combat operations. She couldn't answer the call anymore. Her flying days were behind her, traded for rank and responsibility and the slow, inevitable progression toward retirement. But someone would answer it. Another pilot with the skill and determination to earn that trust, to meet that standard, to become worthy of the call sign that had come to mean something larger than one person's accomplishments. On the day she retired, the Air Force held a ceremony at Nellie's with full military honors. They read her citations, listed her decorations, summarized a career that had spanned 2 decades and multiple combat deployments. The words were accurate but incomplete. They couldn't capture the texture of those early missions when every sortie was an audition. They couldn't convey the feeling of bringing a shot-up aircraft home or the weight of trust from men who didn't give it easily. They couldn't explain what it meant to be competent in a profession that demanded excellence and to have that competence constantly questioned for reasons beyond your control. When they called her forward to receive her retirement certificate and American flag, she walked across the stage with the same steady stride that had carried her to and from 100 aircraft. She accepted the honors with grace, but what she really saw was the audience. The students she'd taught, now flying their own missions. The commanders who'd learned to value capability over prejudice. The young women in uniform who'd followed paths she'd helped clear. That was the real retirement gift, knowing she'd made a difference that would echo forward in ways she'd never see or measure. Her final act in uniform was to visit the aviation museum on base where they'd put her original A-10 on display. The one she'd brought back bleeding fuel with hydraulics shot and holes punched through the fuselage. They'd restored it to flight-worthy condition, then retired it to the museum as an example of what the aircraft and its pilots could endure. The placard beneath the nose detailed the mission, the damage, the landing. Visitors could walk beneath the wings and see the repaired panels, the replaced hydraulic lines, the scars that had been fixed but remained visible if you knew where to look. Mariana stood before it for a long time, this machine that had carried her through fire and brought her home. She ran her hand along the fuselage one last time, feeling the smooth, cold aluminum beneath her palm. They'd preserved it perfectly, but it was just metal and rivets now, a static display instead of a living weapon. Still, it mattered that someone had thought to save it, to show future generations what was possible when skill and determination met impossible circumstances and refused to break. She walked away from the museum and out into the Nevada sunshine, no longer a captain, no longer a pilot, just a veteran carrying the weight of everything she'd done and learned. The sky above was infinite and empty, the kind of canvas she used to own. She'd given up that ownership willingly, trading flight for legacy, missions for meaning. But part of her would always be up there, circling at 4,000 feet, watching over people who needed someone vigilant and capable and unwilling to quit when the situation demanded staying. The SEALs who'd learned to trust her were still out there, conducting missions in places whose names were classified. The pilots she'd trained were flying combat operations over hostile terrain. The women who'd seen her speak at the academy were progressing through their careers with the knowledge that competence created opportunity even when opportunity didn't come naturally. That was enough. That had to be enough. She'd done what she set out to do, proven what needed proving, and left the door open for those who'd come after. The rest was someone else's mission now. She'd earned the right to let it go.